I was dead, gone. And in that moment, I discovered a truth that shattered everything I had ever believed. For my entire life, I was convinced that salvation had to be earned, that my good works, my devotion, my obedience were the keys to heaven. But when I died, I saw the truth, and it changed everything. I met Jesus, not as a distant figure, not as a concept, but as a living, powerful presence. And what he told me will shock you. What if I told you that everything you thought about salvation might be wrong? What if heaven and hell aren't what we've been told? Stay with me until the end, because this story will challenge everything you think you know about eternity. And if you've ever wondered whether you were truly saved, then you need to hear this. Before we dive in, make sure you're subscribed. So many people watch these stories without subscribing, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Hit that button, and let's begin. My name is Ethan, and for most of my life, I believed I had everything figured out. I was raised in a devoted Mormon family, where faith, discipline, and service were the pillars of our existence. From a young age, I was taught that salvation was something we had to work for through good deeds, unwavering commitment, and strict adherence to the teachings of the church. And I took that seriously. I served on mission trips, spent countless hours volunteering in my community, and dedicated myself to being a loving husband and father. To me, my faith wasn't just a belief, it was my identity, my foundation, my purpose. I found comfort in the idea that if I did everything right, if I followed every rule and gave my best to God and others, I would one day earn my place in His presence. But even with my deep devotion, there were always lingering questions, ones I tried to push away. What if I wasn't doing enough? What if my efforts still fell short? I never voiced these doubts out loud, afraid that questioning would be seen as a sign of weak faith. Instead, I buried them under more work, more prayer, more dedication. Life, however, has a way of forcing us to face the things we try to avoid. And for me, that moment came when I received the news that no one ever wants to hear. A diagnosis, a countdown, a reality I couldn't ignore. Suddenly, all the works I had done, all the sacrifices I had made, none of it seemed to matter anymore. I was staring into the unknown, and for the first time, I had to ask myself, was it enough? Had I truly secured my place with God? Little did I know, I was about to get an answer, but it wouldn't be anything like what I expected. When the doctor told me I had late-stage cancer, time seemed to stop. My wife squeezed my hand so tightly that it hurt, but I barely felt it. The words echoed in my head, cold and final. I had spent my entire life serving God, following the path I believed was right, but in that moment, all I could feel was fear. At first, I clung to my faith the way I always had. I prayed harder, fasted longer, and sought blessings from church leaders. I believed that if I demonstrated enough faith, God would heal me. After all, wasn't that what we were taught? That miracles came to those who truly believed. But as the weeks passed and my condition worsened, a terrifying thought crept into my mind. What if my faith wasn't enough? Lying in bed at night, staring at the ceiling, I wrestled with questions I had never dared to entertain. I had always believed that salvation required effort, that I had to prove myself worthy. But how could I ever be sure I had done enough? What if I had failed in ways I wasn't even aware of? The uncertainty was unbearable. I tried to push these doubts aside, but the fear only grew. I felt trapped between my faith and my reality, between everything I had been taught and the unshakable feeling that something was missing. And then the moment came, the one that would change everything, the day I died. I don't remember the exact moment my body gave out. 1 second, I was in a hospital bed, surrounded by my wife and children, their faces blurred by my fading vision. The next, I was outside of it, floating, watching. I could see myself lying there, pale and lifeless. My wife was clutching my hand, sobbing uncontrollably, while doctors and nurses moved frantically around me, their voices tense and urgent. I should have felt afraid. I should have panicked, but instead, I felt strangely detached, as if I were merely an observer in someone else's tragedy. Then, something shifted. The hospital room began to fade, the edges dissolving like mist. In its place, a vast darkness stretched out before me, not empty, but waiting. I felt weightless, unbound by my body, yet more alive than I had ever been. Time didn't seem to exist. Every sound, every movement around me became distant, muffled, like echoes in a dream. That's when I realized I was dead. The thought should have terrified me, but it didn't. Instead, an overwhelming sense of clarity washed over me. For the first time, I understood what it meant to exist beyond the physical world. I had spent my whole life believing in the afterlife, but nothing could have prepared me for this. Then, from the distance, something called to me, a presence, a force unlike anything I had ever known. And before I could even comprehend what was happening, I felt myself being pulled toward it. At first, I saw nothing, only an endless expanse stretching beyond comprehension. But then, a glow emerged in the distance, faint at first, then growing brighter, warmer. It wasn't just light, it was alive. It radiated something beyond mere brightness, something that filled me with a deep, undeniable sense of peace. As I moved closer, the warmth intensified, wrapping around me like the embrace of a long-lost friend. It wasn't just a presence. It was awareness. It knew me. Every thought, every doubt, every fear I had ever carried, saw them all. Yet instead of judgment, I felt only love. Pure, overwhelming, unconditional love. Then, a voice, not spoken aloud, yet resonating deep within me. It was familiar, as if I had known it my entire life, but had somehow forgotten. It didn't speak in words, yet I understood completely. It called me by name, not my earthly name, but something deeper, something truer. The closer I got, the more I felt my earthly worries slipping away. Fear of death, the anxiety of not being enough, full of it, melted in the presence of this radiant being. I wanted to go further, to let myself be consumed by this love and light, but something held me back. A question buried deep within me surfaced with undeniable force. What about everything I believed? Was this what I was meant to find? And then the answer came. Not in words, not in doctrine, but in a presence more powerful than anything I had ever imagined. I was about to meet him. The light intensified, and suddenly he was there. Not as a distant figure, not as an abstract presence, but as a being more real than anything I had ever known. Jesus. I had spent my entire life believing in him, but nothing could have prepared me for this moment. He wasn't just a figure in scripture, not just a historical teacher or a moral guide. He was power, he was love, and he knew me completely. Every thought I had ever had, every struggle, every failure, every moment of doubt, and yet there was no condemnation in his eyes, only deep, unshakable compassion. I fell to my knees, not because I was forced to, but because there was no other response in the presence of such holiness. I wanted to speak, to explain myself, to tell him that I had tried my best to live a good life. But before I could say anything, he reached out. The moment his presence touched me, a wave of truth washed over me. I saw my life through his eyes, not as a list of achievements or failures, but as a story of love, of searching, of longing for something I had never fully grasped. And then he spoke. You were never meant to earn my love. The words struck me like thunder. My entire life, I had believed that salvation was something to be worked for, something to be achieved through obedience and devotion. But in that moment, I understood. Salvation was never about what I could do. It was about what He had already done. Tears streamed down my face as I realized the depth of the truth before me. Everything I had strived for, every attempt to be good enough, had been unnecessary. Not because God didn't care about righteousness, but because His love was never something to be earned. It was freely given. And that truth would change everything. I had spent my entire life believing that salvation was something I had to achieve, reward for righteousness, a prize for obedience. But in the presence of Jesus, that belief shattered. He didn't accuse me. He didn't list my sins or weigh my good deeds against my failures. Instead, His eyes held a love so pure, so overwhelming, that it undid me completely. I felt every burden I had ever carried, the fear of not being enough, the pressure to prove my worth simply fall away. You cannot earn what has already been given, He said. And in an instant, I knew. Salvation wasn't a transaction. It wasn't about tallying up good works or proving myself worthy. It was a gift purchased not by my effort, but by His sacrifice. I saw it His suffering, His death, His resurrection, not as distant events from history, but as the very heartbeat of reality. It was finished. The price had already been paid. All that was left for me to do was accept it. A flood of emotions rushed through me: relief, joy, but also grief. How had I missed this? How had I spent my entire life striving for something that had been freely offered all along? Jesus knew my thoughts. He smiled not with disappointment, but with understanding. Now that you know the truth, He said, what will you do with it? And just like that, I saw something new: visions that would shake me to my core. As soon as Jesus spoke, my surroundings changed. The brilliance of His presence faded, and I found myself standing in a place so beautiful, so alive, that words feel inadequate to describe it. Heaven wasn't just light, it was life. Colors more vibrant than anything on earth, a peace so deep it resonated through my very soul. But the most astonishing part wasn't the beauty of the place, it was the presence of God. I didn't just see Him, I felt Him everywhere, in everything. His love filled every corner, every breath, every thought. I saw people laughing, embracing, completely whole in a way that went beyond physical appearance. There was no pain, no regret, no longing, only fulfillment, complete and unshakable. And then, in an instant, it was gone. I was somewhere else, now somewhere wrong. The absence of light was the first thing I noticed. It wasn't just darkness, it was emptiness. The air felt heavy, thick with despair. I heard voices, some whispering, some crying out, but what struck me most was the absence of God. It was like a limb had been ripped from my body, like something essential had been stripped away. The people here weren't being tortured the way I had once imagined. No fire, no demons chasing them. But they were suffering in a way that was far worse. They were completely and utterly alone, cut off from the presence of God, trapped in the consequences of their own rejection of Him. And the worst part, they knew it. They knew what they had lost, and they knew it was too late. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. Why are you showing me this? Because you must tell them, He said. You must warn them. But more than that, you must tell them of my love, the way home. And just like that, I felt myself being pulled, away from eternity, and thrust back into my earthly body. The moment I was back in my body, I gasped for air, like a drowning man breaking the surface. Nurses and doctors rushed around me, their voices filled with shock and confusion. But I barely noticed them. My mind was still reeling from what I had seen, what I had learned. Jesus had given me a mission. It wasn't enough that I had experienced the truth. I had to share it. I had to tell others what I had seen, what He had revealed. that salvation wasn't something we had to earn, that hell was real not just as punishment, but as the tragic consequence of rejecting God's love, that heaven wasn't a reward for the righteous, but a home for those who accepted the gift of grace. As the reality of my return set in, so did the weight of my task. How would people react? My entire life had been built on the belief that obedience and good works secured salvation. But now, I knew the truth. It was all about Jesus. Would my family, my church, even believe me? Lying in that hospital bed, I closed my eyes and whispered, "God, give me the strength." And then, another miracle happened. The doctors couldn't explain it. Just days before, my body had been shutting down, organs failing, cancer spreading beyond hope. But now, it was gone, completely. Scans showed no trace of the disease that had been killing me. Blood work came back normal. The medical staff called it unbelievable, but I knew the truth. I had been healed. Not just spiritually, but physically. And that meant only one thing. Jesus had brought me back for a reason. At first, I was overwhelmed. How could I possibly put into words what I had seen? How could I tell my family, my friends, my church, that everything we believed about earning salvation was wrong? That heaven and hell weren't about our deeds, but about accepting or rejecting Christ. But every time doubt crept in, I remembered his words. You must tell them. So I started with my wife. I held her hands, looked into her tear-filled eyes, and told her everything. She listened in stunned silence, and when I finished, she simply whispered, "I believe you." That was all I needed to take the next step, to share my story with my church, my community, the world, but not everyone was ready to hear it. And some, I soon realized, didn't want to hear it at all. I expected people to be shocked. I expected questions, but I wasn't prepared for the outright resistance. When I shared my experience with my church leaders, their expressions shifted from curiosity to discomfort and, finally, to skepticism. Some listened carefully, clearly moved, but others seemed almost defensive. God's grace is important, one of them said, choosing his words carefully, but works are the evidence of our faith. Surely you're not saying they don't matter at all. I'm saying salvation isn't about works, I answered. It's about Jesus, about accepting what he's already done. Our good deeds should come from love, not from trying to qualify for heaven. That didn't sit well with everyone. Some saw my testimony as an attack on everything we had been taught. Whispers began questions about whether I had really experienced what I claimed, whether my mind had been affected by the trauma of dying. A few even suggested that what I saw wasn't from God, but a deception. But others did believe. Some wept as I spoke, as if something deep inside them had been waiting for this truth. Some told me that my words confirmed what they had long suspected, but had been too afraid to question. The reactions were mixed. Some embraced the message, some outright rejected it. But one thing was clear. I couldn't unsee what I had seen. I couldn't deny what I now knew to be true. And no matter the opposition, I wasn't going to stop sharing it. Despite the opposition, I knew what I had to do. The truth I had seen, the gift of grace, the reality of heaven and hell, the overwhelming love of Jesus was too powerful to keep to myself. Some people walked away from me, unwilling to let go of the belief that salvation had to be earned. But others leaned in, desperate to understand, to experience the freedom I had found. I saw lives transformed not because of me, but because of him. People who had spent their whole lives trying to be good enough finally understood that they didn't have to strive anymore. They simply had to accept the love that had been waiting for them all along. As for me, my life would never be the same. I was no longer just a Mormon, no longer bound by a system of rules and expectations. I was simply his, a child of God, saved by grace, alive not just in body but in spirit. And now, my mission was clear. to tell the world, to spread the truth, to share what I had seen, no matter the cost. Because if even one person could be set free by this message, then everything I had been through, my doubts, my death, my return, would have been worth it. I had been given a second chance, and I wouldn't waste it. So now I have to ask you, what do you believe? I died and came back with a truth that changed everything. Salvation isn't something we achieve, it's a gift that's already been given, waiting for you to accept it. But the question is, will you? Let me know in the comments. Do you believe in grace alone, or do you think works play a role in salvation? I want to hear your thoughts. And if this story moved you, share it. Someone out there needs to hear this. Before you go, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications. There's another incredible story coming next, and trust me, you won't want to miss it.